In April 1961, roughly 50 of the most experienced foreign policy minds in the United States government sat in a room and agreed to invade Cuba. They had the CIA's assessment, they had the Joint Chiefs' endorsement. They had a newly elected president who had campaigned as an anti-communist hawk and who was told by his inherited intelligence apparatus that the operation would succeed. The invasion force, 1,400 CIA-trained Cuban exiles, landed at the Bay of Pigs on April 17th. Within 72 hours, it was over. 114 men were dead, nearly 1,200 were captured. The United States was humiliated on the world stage. Fidel Castro was stronger than he had been the week before. Afterward, President Kennedy asked the question that this show exists to answer. "There were 50 or so of us," he said, "presumably the most experienced and smartest people we could get. But 5 minutes after it began to fall in, we all looked at each other and asked, how could we have been so stupid?" 13 months later, the same president, in the same office, with many of the same advisors, faced a crisis that made the Bay of Pigs look like a rehearsal. Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba. 13 days in which the wrong decision could have killed hundreds of millions of people. He got it right the second time. Same man, same office, different structure. That difference is the subject of this episode. This is the 10th Man Podcast. Welcome back to the 10th Man. I'm Chris Porden. 5 episodes in, the pattern has been consistent. A system fails because the consensus suppresses the challenge, and afterward, someone builds a mechanism to prevent it from happening again. In the Yom Kippur story, there was no mechanism. With Challenger, the mechanism had no weight. In medicine, 2,000 years of confident consensus killed patients until a sealed envelope was invented to remove the physician from the answer. In aviation, the hierarchy that made the captain God was systematically dismantled. In finance, the dissent existed but could be destroyed by the market before the market admitted it was wrong. This episode is different in a specific way. This is the first episode in the series where the failure and the fix happened to the same person. One man learning from his own catastrophic error, redesigning the room he sits in, and doing it in time for the redesign to matter. The Bay of Pigs is also the event that gave the failure mode its name. A Yale psychologist named Irving Yannis spent years studying Kennedy's decision-making process and coined a term for what he found. A term that has since been applied to everything from the Challenger disaster to the Iraq War to corporate boardrooms around the world. He called it groupthink. This episode is about what groupthink actually is, why the Bay of Pigs became its defining case study, what Kennedy changed afterward, and why the academic who named the disease may have gotten the diagnosis partly wrong, without that mattering as much as you'd think. To understand the Bay of Pigs, you have to understand that Kennedy did not design the operation. He inherited it. In March 1960, President Eisenhower had authorized the CIA to train a force of Cuban exiles for a covert operation to overthrow Fidel Castro. The plan had been developed by CIA Director Allen Dulles and his Director of Plans, Richard Bissell. By the time Kennedy took office in January 1961, the operation had its own momentum. A trained force of roughly 1,400 men in camps in Guatemala, a logistics pipeline, an air component, and a set of assumptions that had never been seriously tested. The core assumption was that the landing would trigger a popular uprising against Castro. Cuban civilians, the CIA believed, would rally to the invaders. Castro's military would fracture. The regime would fall. This assumption was not supported by the CIA's own analytical branch because the analytical branch was never consulted. The operational side of the CIA ran the planning in secrecy. The people whose job it was to assess whether the plan's premises were sound were excluded from the process. Kennedy was briefed on the plan as president-elect. He was skeptical. When an aide asked what he thought about the invasion idea, Kennedy replied, "I think about it as little as possible." But he was in a political trap. He had campaigned as tougher on Cuba than Nixon. He knew Nixon, as Eisenhower's vice president, was aware of the plan. If Kennedy canceled the operation, and it later became public that he had inherited a ready-made force and stood it down, the political cost would be severe. A new president, 3 months into his term, seen as soft on communism. The CIA's Dulles was confident. He had overseen the successful covert overthrow of the Arbenz government in Guatemala in 1954. He had experience. He had stature. He was, in Kennedy's own later words, a legendary figure in the government, never known to have made a mistake. Kennedy approved the plan. He made modifications, moving the landing site from Trinidad to the Bay of Pigs for a lower profile, canceling a second round of airstrikes to preserve deniability. Each modification degraded the plan's already questionable chances of success. And nobody in the room told him clearly enough that the modifications were fatal, because the room was not structured to produce that clarity. Here is what the decision-making process looked like in the weeks before the invasion. Kennedy convened meetings with his senior advisors, the Joint Chiefs, the CIA leadership, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, National Security Advisor. These were not structured deliberations with assigned roles or formal challenge mechanisms. They were just meetings in which the president was present. His preference was known, and the institutional weight of the CIA and the military was arrayed on the side of proceeding. Senator William Fulbright, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was brought into the process. He had written Kennedy a memorandum opposing the invasion on diplomatic and moral grounds. At an April 4th meeting of the State Department, Fulbright was given the floor. Arthur Schlesinger, a Kennedy advisor and historian, described what happened next. Fulbright delivered what Schlesinger called a brave, old-fashioned American speech, honorable, sensible, and strong. He denounced the operation as disproportionate to the threat and incompatible with American principles. The room listened, and the room was, in Schlesinger's account, wholly unmoved. When Kennedy went around the table for a final vote, only Fulbright dissented. Everyone else, the Joint Chiefs, the Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, the Secretary of State Dean Rusk, the CIA, approved. Schlesinger himself had written a memorandum to the president opposing the invasion. He had warned Kennedy that the operation would dissipate all the extraordinary goodwill which has been rising toward the new administration throughout the world. But in the meetings, Schlesinger held back. He later described why in terms that became central to Irving Yannis's analysis. In the months after the Bay of Pigs, I bitterly reproached myself for having kept so silent during those crucial discussions in the cabinet room. I can only explain my failure to do more than raise a few timid questions by reporting that one's impulse to blow the whistle on this nonsense was simply undone by the circumstances of the discussion. There's a detail in this story that captures the dynamic more precisely than anything Schlesinger wrote in retrospect. Before the invasion at a social event, Robert Kennedy, the president's brother and U.S. Attorney General, took Schlesinger aside. He told him, "You may be right or not, but the president has made up his mind. Now is the time for everyone to help him all they can." That sentence is the sound of a door closing. A social instruction. The decision is made. Loyalty now requires silence. Schlesinger, who had serious doubts, who had put those doubts in writing, heard that instruction and complied. Schlesinger later observed that the meetings took place in what he called a curious atmosphere of assumed consensus. Nobody polled the room to see if agreement was genuine. Silence was treated as assent. The absence of objection was taken as the presence of support. The invasion proceeded. It failed in every dimension. Castro's forces were not weakened by internal revolt. The exile brigade was overwhelmed. The second airstrike that might have provided cover had been canceled by Kennedy to protect deniability. The exiles had been told they could retreat to the Escambray Mountains if the landing failed, but those mountains were 80 miles away through swampland. The plan contained assumptions that disintegrated on contact with reality, and no one in the decision-making process had been structurally empowered to disintegrate them first. The Bay of Pigs became one of the most studied decision-making failures in American history. But the study that gave it a permanent place in the language of organizational psychology came more than a decade later. Irving Yannis was a research psychologist at Yale who had spent years studying the effects of stress on group cohesion. In the early 1970s, he turned his attention to a question that the Bay of Pigs made urgent. How does a group of intelligent, experienced, well-intentioned people arrive at a decision that is, in retrospect, obviously catastrophic? Yannis published his answer in 1972 in a book titled Victims of Groupthink. He revised and expanded it in 1982. The term he coined, groupthink, entered the language immediately, and it's never left. Janis defined groupthink as a mode of thinking in which the members' desire for unanimity overrides their ability to realistically appraise alternative courses of action. It's a process failure in which the group's cohesion, the very thing that makes it function as a team, becomes the mechanism that prevents it from functioning as a thinking body. Janis identified 8 symptoms. They're worth naming because every one of them was present in the Bay of Pigs decision room, and because several of them have appeared in every episode of this show. An illusion of invulnerability. The group believes it cannot fail. Collective rationalization. Warnings are explained away rather than examined. Belief in the group's inherent morality, the assumption that the group's intentions are good and therefore its decisions must be sound. Stereotyping of the opposition, in this case, the assumption that Castro's forces were weak and his popular support was fragile. Pressure on dissenters, Robert Kennedy's instruction to Schlesinger. Self-censorship, Schlesinger's decision to suppress his own objections in meetings. An illusion of unanimity, silence interpreted as agreement. And finally, mindguards, self-appointed members who shield the group from information that might challenge the consensus. Janis identified Robert Kennedy and Secretary of State Dean Rusk as having played this role, filtering dissent before it could reach the president. The Bay of Pigs had all 8. Janis used it as his primary case study, the archetype against which every subsequent instance of groupthink would be measured. But Janis did something else with the Bay of Pigs that makes his work really matter for this series. He didn't just diagnose the disease. He studied the cure. And the cure had already happened 13 months later in the same building with the same president. On the morning of October 16, 1962, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy informed President Kennedy that U-2 reconnaissance photographs had confirmed the presence of Soviet medium-range ballistic missiles in Cuba. The missiles were capable of reaching most of the eastern United States. They were under construction, and they would soon be operational. Kennedy convened a group of 14 advisors. They became known as ExComm, the Executive Committee of the National Security Council. Over the next 13 days, ExComm deliberated on how to respond. The options ranged from a full-scale invasion of Cuba to a diplomatic approach to doing nothing. The Joint Chiefs of Staff unanimously recommended airstrikes, followed by invasion. The outcome is now well known. Kennedy chose a naval blockade, a quarantine, and through a combination of diplomacy, back-channel negotiation, and restraint, the crisis was resolved without military conflict. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles. The world did not end. What matters for this episode is not the outcome, but the process. Because the process Kennedy used for the missile crisis was deliberately, explicitly, structurally different from the process that had produced the Bay of Pigs. And the differences were not accidental. Kennedy had learned, and what he learned he turned into architecture. Here's what he changed. First, Kennedy deliberately removed himself from many of the ExComm meetings. This was a structural decision. Kennedy understood, because the Bay of Pigs had taught him, that when the president is in the room, the president's preference becomes the gravitational center. Advisors orient toward it. They interpret ambiguous signals as directives. They self-censor to avoid contradicting the leader. By leaving the room, Kennedy removed the gravitational center and forced his advisors to deliberate without a signal to orient toward. Janis specifically cited this as a key anti-groupthink measure. Second, Robert Kennedy was assigned the role of devil's advocate. The same man who had functioned as a mind guard during the Bay of Pigs, who had told Schlesinger to fall in line, was now structurally tasked with arguing against whatever course of action was gaining consensus. His job was to challenge, to push back, to force the group to defend its reasoning against the strongest version of the opposing case. The role reversal is remarkable. Same person, different mandate, different structure, different behavior. Third, ExComm was divided into subgroups. Rather than always meeting as a single body where the pressure toward unanimity compounds, smaller groups worked independently on different options. When the subgroups reconvened, the diversity of their conclusions forced genuine debate rather than gravitational convergence. Fourth, outside experts were invited into the process. Dean Acheson, the former Secretary of State, was brought in. So was Adlai Stevenson, the ambassador to the United Nations, who held views sharply different from the hawks on the committee. The group's boundaries were deliberately made porous. Information and perspectives from outside the inner circle were treated as resources, not intrusions. Fifth, XCOM organized what amounted to a structured moot court. Members were assigned to advocate for specific policy positions, while others cross-examined them, probing for weaknesses. This is a formalized adversarial process, a designed contest between competing positions with the explicit goal of finding the holes in each one. The result was a decision-making process that looked nothing like the Bay of Pigs. Positions shifted, people changed their minds. The initial consensus, which favored airstrikes, dissolved as the group worked through the implications. Kennedy himself moved from supporting military action on the first day to choosing the blockade by the end of the week. The process permitted that movement because it was designed to produce challenge, not confirmation. Yanis evaluated the XCOM process and concluded that none of the 8 symptoms of groupthink were present. The same president, the same office, many of the same people, and a fundamentally different outcome. The variable was the structure of the room. There's a postscript to this that deserves a moment. After the crisis was resolved, declassified information revealed that had Kennedy accepted the Joint Chiefs' recommendation for airstrikes, American forces invading Cuba would have encountered approximately 40,000 Soviet troops, 4 times the 10,000 that the CIA had estimated, along with an arsenal of Soviet tactical nuclear weapons that American intelligence had not detected. Kennedy remarked privately that the Joint Chiefs had one great advantage. If we listen to them and do what they want us to do, none of us will be alive later to tell them that they were wrong. The structure of the room in October 1962 may have prevented a global nuclear war. The Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis are the same experiment run twice, with one variable changed. The variable is the decision-making structure. Understanding what changed is understanding the argument of this entire series. First, the leader's position was hidden. In the Bay of Pigs meetings, Kennedy was present, his preference was legible, and advisors oriented toward it. In XCOM, Kennedy removed himself from the room during key deliberations. The group could not defer to him because he was not there to defer to. This is the same principle as Bradford Hill's sealed envelope in episode 3, removing the authority figure from the process so the process can produce an honest answer. Second, the mindguard became the devil's advocate. Robert Kennedy's role flipped from suppressing dissent to demanding it. In April 1961, RFK's structural role was to protect the president's decision from challenge. In October 1962, his structural role was to ensure the president's options were challenged. The person was identical. The structure made him opposite. Third, the group's boundaries were opened. The Bay of Pigs was planned in secrecy, so secret that the CIA's own analytical branch never assessed the plan's assumptions. XCOM invited outsiders. It sought perspectives that contradicted the emerging consensus. The insulation that Yanis identified as a structural precondition for groupthink was deliberately removed. Fourth, the burden of proof was distributed. In the Bay of Pigs process, the CIA presented its plan, and the question was whether anyone could prove it would fail. That is an impossible standard, the same inverted burden of proof that destroyed the Challenger engineer's objection in episode 2. In XCOM, the moot court format required every option to be defended against attack. No position was presumed correct. Every position had to survive cross-examination. Fifth, silence was not treated as agreement. In the Bay of Pigs meetings, Schlesinger's silence was interpreted as assent. The curious atmosphere of assumed consensus permitted the group to proceed without genuine unanimity. In XCOM, the subgroup structure and adversarial format made it structurally difficult for silence to masquerade as consensus, because the process required active participation in the contest of ideas. Each of these changes maps to a failure mode documented in the previous 5 episodes of this show. The leader's hidden position addresses the Yom Kippur problem, the hierarchy that owns both the question and the conclusion. The devil's advocate addresses the challenger problem, dissent that exists but has no structural weight. The opened boundaries address the medical problem, a closed system that evaluates itself by its own criteria. The distributed burden of proof addresses the inverted standard that has appeared across every episode. And the prohibition on treating silence as agreement addresses the most basic mechanism of consensus failure, the assumption that because no one is objecting, everyone agrees. Kennedy had never read Irving Janis. Janis hadn't written anything yet. Kennedy learned from his own catastrophe and rebuilt the room from instinct and bitter experience. Janis came later and explained why the rebuild worked. The fact that they arrived at the same structural conclusions from opposite directions, one from practice, one from theory, is itself evidence that the conclusions are correct. This show is committed to complicating its own narratives from time to time. Here's today's complication. In 1998, psychologist Roderick Kramer of Stanford re-examined the Bay of Pigs decision using declassified documents, oral histories, and memoirs that had not been available to Janis in the 1970s. Kramer's conclusion was that Janis had overstated the role of group dynamics and understated the role of political calculation. Kramer argued that Kennedy's decision was driven less by the pressure of group cohesion and more by what Kramer called politico-think, the tendency of political leaders to evaluate options primarily in terms of their political consequences. Kennedy was not swept along by a group that had lost its capacity for critical thinking. He was making a political calculation. The cost of canceling the invasion, looking weak, being accused of abandoning the anti-Castro exiles, giving Nixon ammunition, that weighed more heavily than the uncertain military risks of proceeding. In Kramer's analysis, Kennedy had private doubts that went deeper than Janis acknowledged. He was not a victim of the group's illusion of invulnerability. He was a president weighing political survival against military risk and choosing the option that minimized his political exposure. This matters a lot because it echoes a structural factor that this show has documented before. In episode 1, the Israeli intelligence establishment's refusal to take the Egyptian threat seriously was partly driven by the asymmetric cost of different kinds of errors. A false alarm, full mobilization of reserves 3 weeks before an election, was enormously expensive. Being wrong about the threat was catastrophic, but the political and financial cost of the cautionary response was immediate and visible, while the cost of inaction was hypothetical and deferred. The same asymmetry operated on Kennedy. The cost of canceling was immediate and certain. The cost of proceeding was contingent on the plan failing, and the CIA was telling him it wouldn't fail. The empirical evidence for the groupthink model itself has also proven weaker than its cultural influence suggests. In the decades since Janis published, researchers have struggled to replicate his predictions in controlled settings. Some studies have found that group cohesion actually reduces self-censorship and increases dissent, the opposite of what Janis predicted. The British Psychological Society published an assessment noting that the groupthink model may function more as a compelling narrative than a rigorous causal theory. I'm flagging this with the same discipline this show applied to the World War Z mythology in episode 1 and to Diane Vaughan's revision of the Challenger villain story in episode 2. The clean version of the story, groupthink produced the Bay of Pigs disaster, and its absence produced the missile crisis success, is true enough to be useful, but also incomplete enough to be misleading. But here's what the complication does not change. The structural prescriptions work. Whether the Bay of Pigs was caused by groupthink, politico-think, or some combination of the two, the changes Kennedy made to the XCOM process addressed both failure modes. Removing the president from the room prevents group deference and political signaling simultaneously. Assigning a devil's advocate forces challenge regardless of whether the consensus is driven by group cohesion or political calculation. Opening the group's boundaries brings in perspectives that are insulated from both the social dynamics and the political incentives operating inside the room. The diagnosis may be imperfect, but the prescription still works. There's a final piece of this story that connects it to the structural argument of our entire series. In the spring of 1962, after the Bay of Pigs but before the Missile Crisis, Kennedy had a secret taping system installed in the Oval Office and the Cabinet Room. His personal secretary, Evelyn Lincoln, later recalled the reason. Kennedy was furious after the Bay of Pigs, when several advisors who had supported the invasion in closed meetings claimed afterward to have opposed it. They revised their positions retroactively, once it was safe to have been against the operation. Kennedy's response was to make the record permanent. The tapes could not be revised. What you said in the room was what you said. More than 20 hours of ex-com deliberations during the missile crisis were captured on those tapes and have since been declassified. This is a dissent mechanism that none of the participants knew existed. It functions the same way the NTSB's no-blame investigation architecture functions in Episode 4, by creating a permanent public record that prevents institutional amnesia. The NTSB ensures that every crash becomes a lesson that cannot be forgotten. Kennedy's tapes ensured that every position taken in the room became a matter of record that couldn't be disowned. The irony is that the mechanism required deception. Kennedy secretly recorded his own advisors without their knowledge or consent. The commitment to accurate information required its own form of concealment. That tension is worth acknowledging without resolving. It's the complexity flag for the residue section of this episode. But the structural point holds. In the Bay of Pigs process, advisors could support the invasion privately and distance themselves from it publicly. The absence of a record allowed position shifting, and position shifting made accountability impossible. If you can revise your position after the fact, you have no incentive to get it right before the fact. The tapes closed that gap. 6 episodes in, here is the structure. In the Yom Kippur story, the framework ate the evidence. No mechanism existed to force a challenge. In the Challenger story, the dissent existed but was weightless. The engineers were removed from the room where the decision was made. In medicine, 2,000 years of confident consensus, generating lethal recommendations until a sealed envelope was invented to remove the physician from the answer. In aviation, a culture that made the captain God, dismantled by CRM and the NTSB, doubling safety every decade for 50 years. And then, Boeing, under commercial pressure, selectively erased the mechanism. In finance, the dissent existed, the data was sound, and the market nearly destroyed the dissenters before the consensus broke. The challenge costs money every day. The consensus is free. In the White House, same man, same office, many of the same advisors, and 2 radically different outcomes 13 months apart. The variable was the structure of the room. Kennedy learned from his own failure and redesigned the process that had produced it. He hid his own position. He turned a mindguard into a devil's advocate. He opened the boundaries. He distributed the burden of proof. He made silence impossible to confuse with agreement. This is the first episode in this series where the fix came from the person who made the mistake the first time around. And that matters because it means the structural argument of this show is not only about institutions. It's really about individuals who have the authority and the willingness to change the structure around them, to build a room that challenges its own occupants, including the person who built it. The sealed envelope removes the physician from the answer. CRM removes the captain from the pedestal. Kennedy removed himself from the room. In every case, the structural innovation is the same. The person with the authority deliberately constrains their own ability to dominate the process because they have learned what uncontested confidence produces. Irving Janis gave the failure mode a name. Kennedy, without reading Janis, had already built the cure. The fact that both arrived at the same structural conclusions from theory and from practice independently is the strongest evidence we have that this pattern is real. In our next episode, The Boardroom. In 2010, Amazon codified a leadership principle that would have been unthinkable in most of the institutions this show has examined. Have backbone, disagree, and commit. An obligation built into hiring and evaluation to challenge decisions even when doing so is uncomfortable. At Berkshire Hathaway, Charlie Munger spent 50 years as what colleagues called the abominable no man, a partner whose structural role was to say no to the investment thesis before it could be approved. Two companies, two models, both built on the same premise this show keeps finding in every domain, that the people most likely to be wrong are the people most confident they're right, and that the only reliable defense is to build the challenge into the process before the confidence has time to calcify. Thanks for listening to The 10th Man.